I've got a number of people to blame for that actually, or maybe I should say thanks. Certainly Alison is one person to blame because a paper on this is due in actually Monday. So I've been panicking about that. Margaret, because she spent so much time putting together details of swimmers from the late Victorian and early 20th century related to this topic, which is female swimmers, female teachers, swimming teachers. And a big thank you for that, but it's given me a headache in terms of which of those I actually choose. Sam, for introducing me to prosopography. And me thinking we should be doing something with this, a little bit more detail. And just generally talking to people about the fact that we need to start putting the work that we're doing, and the two really nice presentations there in terms of what there is out there in terms of professional swimming, into some sort of framework, I think. It's not instead of, because I think it's really important we do it, but the kind of descriptive stuff that we're doing, we start to need to use that a little bit more to explore some other areas. So all of those came together into a paper that I have, honestly, Alison, got in. Yeah, I know. It's nearly there. All right, but when I came to mess about with it over the last couple of days for a presentation, the international guys who know that I had dinner last night, I went home from that and I've ripped up everything I did. And so this is actually this morning's effort at this particular presentation. So if it's completely disjointed and it's all over the place, then that's just the way it is, okay. Hopefully you can get something out of it. And hopefully I've done what I've tried to put bits and pieces together into some kind of meaningful story that we can use. Keith's done a lot of work in this area. I've done quite a bit of work in this area, and other people have been working on the female swimming exhibitors in Victorian Britain. And I know John's interested in its impact on people like Lewis Carroll and so on. And he feels, in the short chat we had this morning, that probably we haven't made enough of the eroticism of the seaside and sport. So, and I'm hoping to draw out some of that eroticism in some of the pictures that I'll show you later. All right. So I'm just keeping on tenterhooks really, just to the right for the last 10 seconds of the presentation. So, what I'm planning to do in this paper is to try and link the idea of class and gender and separate spheres. That I want to do that in the framework of female swimming constituencies from the late Victorian Edwardian period. I've got the long Victorian period there. People talk about the long 19th, but the long Victorian essentially is basically the same, but it starts around about the Napoleonic Wars and goes through to the First World War. And I want to use dress, swimming dress, as part of that kind of illustration of class, of differences, and of the way that some of the assumptions we make about separate spheres has to be put in the context of class. Because not all women were the same. Well, we know all women are the same, but in terms of the class that they come from. And the notion of separate spheres has been used, tell me if I'm wandering around too much, okay, has been used in the context of trying to explain the way that parts of Victorian society were compartmentalised. Normally in the context of gender, but I think it probably needs to be applied a little bit more from a class perspective as well. Separate spheres denotes a compartmentalised view of the world. And it's a separation of forms of human association, so gender, class, or whatever, into identifiable areas. So this portion of the social world is your portion of the social world. This portion of the social world is mine. So, for example, we get feminist histories of sport in particular, which postulate this sharp dichotomy between the feminine home and the male workplace. A separation of spheres that brought with it a contrast in both norms of conduct of how you were expected to behave, but also in terms of structures. So structures surrounding the organisations that people belong to, or what people were allowed to do within the confines of those separate spheres. And I hope I'll be able to explain that a little bit more as we go through. Because it doesn't make sense to me just yet, but we'll get it. It has been criticised, this notion of separate spheres elsewhere. Povey, for example, suggested that the negotiation of sphere boundaries was always full of fissures. We talk about class, for example, not being working, middle and upper class because the boundaries between them are permeable and things shift and move and develop over a period of time. But that applies, I think, to all separate spheres that have been applied in some kind of analysis of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. And there's been a difference, I think, between, in the same way that there's a difference in the way that amateurism, at least on the surface, was handled by some, the discourse of amateurism, this is what amateurism is, and the actual practice. I think that there's a separation here, I don't want to use that word again, a fissure here between what people said about separate spheres and how those separate spheres actually operate. Sounds like dinner's arrived. Good. And I want to discuss this idea of separate spheres in the context of 3 female swimming constituencies. We're fairly comfortable with the idea of recreational bathing, and its association with dress in particular has been well made in a number of publications in the past. We're probably less comfortable with the idea of female serious swimming in the late Victorian period, and I'd like to expose some of the class issues around serious swimming in the late Victorian period. And while we've done some work on professionals, we've not really divided female professionals into those who really concentrated on teaching, who were professionals, and separated those from the people who maybe concentrated on display or ornamental swimming and so on. So I'm going to deal with this idea of separate spheres in the context of these different constituencies. And I can whiz through fairly quickly, and you'll be pleased to know there's lots of nice pictures and that there's not an awful lot of writing, although having said that, of course, we've got to have a little bit. In 1755, Johnson defined swimming and bathing as 2 different activities, 2 distinct activities. Swimming was a male activity which was undertaken for exercise and recreation, whereas bathing was an activity participated in by both sexes, normally immersion in cold or warm water as a means of trying to effect a cure for some kind of ailment or to make you feel generally better and so on. So there was a distinction here between swimming and bathing, and that was fully understood in the mid-18th century. And so we get in bathing in the early stages of the of the 19th century, the Victorian period, and actually extending into the mid-Victorian period, we get people wearing appropriate, socially appropriate clothing that denoted their separateness from men and so on, coming out of their little bathing huts obviously very pleased with what's going on and very happy to be in the water or heading towards the water, in costumes that met the requirements of the day about how a woman should behave. Now, I know that during the course of the 19th century, there were an increasing number of trips to seasides by increasingly lower classes of females. But I would argue that certainly for much of the 19th century, and maybe that's something that follows on from what Ray was saying earlier in terms of maybe we've sort of exaggerated in some things, that it was the middle to upper classes who were participating this way in bathing activities at the seaside. And for them, the creation of separate spheres, the separateness of them from the menfolk, the separateness of the home from the workplace, meant that they were required to follow different rules of conduct and propriety. And so this kind of dress was not only a choice in terms of the way it looked, but it was also a necessity in terms of the way of meeting that kind of concept of separate spheres. And even in the late Victorian period, where the idea of function, rational dress, was becoming much more widespread, and we know that from activities such as cycling, and I'm sure most of you in here can point to a number of other areas as well. The dresses still remain inappropriate for swimming. Okay, these are appropriate maybe if you're following the strict guidelines of being separate from men and so on. I mean, one of the things in this period was that because it went through phases, but increasingly in the 19th century, people preferred to be and were required to be taught by members of their own sex. There's a case from the 1850s where a male swimming teacher is taken to court because when he's at the seaside, he's within 50 yards of the female bathing area, which he shouldn't be in the first place. He's stripped to the waist, so he's showing body. And when he's working with one of these female swimmers, the hem of her dress actually floated up to the surface. A bypasser said, as a family man, he was totally disgusted by this approach. So we've got this idea of what's appropriate for females and what's appropriate for males, and that's reflected in the kinds of dress that was worn. Now, a degree of sensibility creeps in towards the end of the 19th century for bathers. We're talking here about bathers. This is actually, interestingly, a combined swimming and gymnastics costume. So you can wear it for your gymnastics class, but you can also wear it in the pool as well. And it's getting a little bit more, it's giving a little bit more function, a little bit more freedom of movement. But it's still, obviously, concentrating on form. What does it look like? And we get into the Edwardian period and we see the bathing dresses, while they're giving it slightly more freedom, so they're recognising this idea of more function, they're still retaining the key things, the frills, the shoulders covered, the top of the legs covered, worn with tights, because you don't show flesh, basically, in bathing situations. And if we took this narrative as typical of what was happening in the 19th century in terms of aquatic sports, then we would get a picture of a very restricted area for women in which they had to wear particular clothing to protect their modesty, which they weren't expected to do anything physically active, but just to go into the water and come out again. That they would always be taught by somebody of their own sex, and that separate sphere idea of their world being significantly different from the male world would just be reinforced. Now, if we took the second picture, the second constituency, in terms of female swimming, we see a different the situation. We see serious women. We see a number of those women wanting to move beyond bathing into a more active participation in the aquatic world. And this develops particularly in the latter stages of the 19th century, and again I really, really think this area has been underexplored, particularly in the upper classes, because upper class swimming became very much in vogue in London at places like the Bath Club in Dover Street. This is from the Illustrated London News. And we've got here, on Ladies' Morning, the men were gracious enough to give them a space in which they could carry out and perform their separate sphere. On Ladies' Morning, we've got a packed baths, and it was packed. I love some of the stories of it. When you read about it, you know, the matron of the baths, that was the woman who was in charge of the women's bathing or whatever, not necessarily a swimming teacher, would normally entertain visitors to tea in her rooms when they arrived. We get the prizes that are being offered for the races that these women increasingly participated in, ranging from all kinds of jewellery to carriage clocks and so on. We get the fact that the only men who were ever allowed in to watch any of their races were fathers and husbands. And there wouldn't be many husbands because women were encouraged, once they got married, to actually give up this kind of activity and move into that separate sphere in the home in these particular classes. Now, just as we see middle-class women during the late 19th century starting to expand their activities beyond the expected, beyond what was expected of them, we see upper-class women like Lady Constance Mackenzie, three-time winner of the captaincy race for the club, becoming something of a little folk hero, and she carried on actually after her marriage, so showing something of a rebellious streak here. She's got a Scottish background, so when she went in for her captaincy race the third time around, the band, because there was a band on the poolside, played Scottish tunes while she dived into the water and swam her captaincy race. She wore a Scottish clan badge on the front of her costume and so on. Now these women, and women like it, were more interested in function than they were in form. They wanted their swimming costumes to enable them to be able to participate in swimming rather than bathing. But they always had to match their requirements for those kinds of costumes against what was expected of them in terms of their separate sphere, in terms of being different. And over a period of time, they learnt to come to terms with it. And it wasn't just the upper class women. Women like Lillian Wallace, who was captain of the Ladies' Tadpole Swimming Club, or Alice Fell, who was captain of Norwood Ladies Swimming Club. There was a presentation to Lillian Wallace a few months before her wedding, it's a few weeks before her wedding, with a writer saying that she wasn't going to resign until the end of the season, even after she was married. So obviously she was a little bit on the rebellious side. There's a supposition that suffragette women, middle-class suffragette women in particular, weren't interested in sport. Well, actually, if you look at the Suffrage Annual and Women's Who's Who from 1913, we see that of the 650 women who were listed there, 175 nominated, well, 215 nominated sporting activities that they participated in. And of that, swimming was one of the most popular. If we look at the Women's Union Swimming Club, which was part of the early trade union movement for women. That was a very popular swimming activity and ran a swimming club. Interestingly, in contrast to the upper class clubs where the times available for women were 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock during the day, because obviously they had the time and the opportunity to participate, for working class women associated with these kinds of clubs, it was in the evening. We see as well schools. The London School Swimming Association taught about 40,000 children a year. And at the annual entertainment in 1900, there were 500 schools. These were all girls' races, age group events, diving championships, junior amateur girls, and team championships. We see temperance associations starting swimming clubs in order to retain members during the slow parts of the year. And the Ravensbourne Swimming Club, which was quite important because they had quite a lot of male influence there from the Amateur Swimming Association. We see at the 18th annual festival an enormous attendance of female competitors as far away from Portsmouth, Leeds, Glasgow and Jersey. And Diane asked the question earlier about water polo. Well, in the final tie here for the first Ladies Water Polo Challenge Shield, Swansea, who travelled up for it, and Swansea, Ladies Water Polo was very popular in Swansea, beat Jersey by 4 goals to 2. Swimming was not restricted to one small group of people. Gradually, as the 19th century went on, more and more people participated. Some of it in controlled situations, some of it in very secluded situations, but there was always, wherever you were, as a woman during this period of time, taking part in a swimming activity, there were always some kind of restrictions, there were some boundaries that were put around you in terms of what you were allowed to do and what you weren't allowed to do. That didn't apply to some members of our third constituency, which were the professionals. This was socially different in terms of both performance and dress. These were the most skilled performers, and just as amateurs and professionals in amateur-professional contrasts or events in other sports, professionals outdid the amateurs, so they did in swimming, female swimming as well. Most of these women were working class women. I'm going to show you some tables in a minute, and these are the tables which a big thank you to Margaret for putting together the basic raw data for me. So Sam keeps moving the camera to try and follow the movement. Look, I'm going to stand. Yeah, okay, right. Working class women, even after marriage, were still in a double bind of home and work. They were not restricted to this separate sphere that was the luxury for other classes. So these estimated wages and percentages of wives employed from 1887 show clearly that in these working class occupations, so you took dock labourers, 25% of dock labourers' women, wives in London worked. Nearly 24% of shoemakers, bricklayers, 22%, and overall, 20% of women, even after marriage, were working. What a life that must have been. Given they were constantly pregnant, or had young children, they had no washing machines, they couldn't, or anything else, they couldn't afford maids. The best they could hope for is one of their daughters, or a few of their daughters, they could actually get to do things for them. And they've got to go out to work as well. It's no wonder that this class had very little opportunity for leisure time. And when we look at, I'll move on because I am starting to waffle apparently. When we move on to look at the female performers and the female swimming teachers, we've often said, oh, these are working class, but we haven't actually provided any evidence. And it's the prosopography, thank you Sam, and the data, thank you Robert, putting those two things together that will draw out the fact that actually we can start to evidence the fact that most of these people were working class, but they weren't lumpen proletariat. They were skilled working class or lower middle class. If you took the father's occupation as indication of what kind of class they might have come from, then in these instances we've got an accountant, an aquarium manager, assurance agent, brush maker, cabinet, gas fitter, hairdresser, pedal steel maker, railway guard and so on. So our female artistes came from a particular class of society. If you look at our female swimming teachers, and the period we're talking about here is essentially the 1880s to the 1911 census. This is only a snapshot. There's a huge number of swimming mistresses during this period of time. Look, beer retailer, boat maker, butcher, cab driver, cooper, dock worker, joiner, labourer. These women came from a particular class. The expectation was that they would work. What they chose to do was to work in these kind of areas. So yes, we are talking about lower middle and working class women. And we can start using by using the prosopography to actually uncover a little bit more about who did what and when. And we can see, and I've deliberately left out of this, the leading swimming families from the 19th and early 20th centuries. We can see from this that a number of them came out of families where the father was already involved in some kind of swimming occupation. So we're starting to get a picture here about what these women looked like, where they came from and so on. And when they performed outside the boundaries that actually applied to other individuals. They performed in these kinds of dresses. These are the Johnson sisters sitting on their father's knee. And these are all the Johnson sisters. So he was obviously pretty active. The three main Johnson sisters and Teresa, who was actually as fast as anybody during the course of in terms of being in the water during the course of the 19th century. And we see natational dresses that aren't about function, aren't about form alone, they're a combination of both. You have to be able to perform in the water, and you have to wear something that's attractive to the audience. And it doesn't match the kind of, the separate spheres that the middle class women were involved in, which meant their swimming clubs were out of the gaze of males. You had to be in the gaze of males in order to be able to earn a living by doing this kind of thing. So you had to be out there in the public. So by doing this, you were already contravening this idea of separate spheres. And I think we can detect an evolution in the length and shape of dresses as we go through the latter stages of the 19th century. And in Agnes's case here, we can see a change as she goes through. Because I've been given the wink, as it were, or the trapdoor, I'm going to finish on this one. As Agnes got older, what I find interesting to see is that our costumes of the swimmers actually became baggier. They hid the body shape more during that period of time. And I'm not quite sure why. At a time when rational dress was coming in and people were accepting swimming costumes more than they were before, that actually the dresses that the natationists started to wear were actually much more they hid the shape of the body a little bit more. I can understand in Agatha's case, because I mean she's getting into her 40s or 50s here, and maybe she feels that she needs to, but there is a change, and that's a change that I'd quite like to explore. Shed loads of other things I want to explore as well, and that's part of the joy of being involved in what we do in terms of sports history and all that. I just think that by accepting uncritically the idea of separate spheres, without looking deeper into that kind of concept, particularly in terms of gender, to ally that with some ideas and notions around class, means that we miss the point. That for working class women, these working class women, separate spheres was not an issue. They were expected to work, and they would be expected to work, and so this was what their work was. This is what they did. And this is the way in which they did it, and this is the way in which it was appropriate. And I think it was received in the way that they wanted it to be received, certainly from the material you read. Yes, there were restrictions elsewhere. Yes, the upper class women and upper middle class and middle class women were restricted by this notion of separate spheres. But I think we need to look beyond it and start to use some more evidence and data to be able to start to challenge some of these conceptions that we have. That's where I am at the moment, so there you go.
We can probably just about squeeze in, well, maybe two questions.